You're listening to the University of Liverpool podcast, brought to you by the University of Liverpool online programs. Make a plan to advance your career today. Study a postgraduate degree with a world-class university without leaving your home or full-time job. You don't have to go far to go further.
Welcome to the University of Liverpool podcast. I'm Neil Morrison. On June 3rd, 2017, 3 men in a van plowed into crowds on London Bridge before going on a stabbing spree. 7 people were killed, 48 were wounded. In the hours and days that followed, police quickly moved into neighborhoods where the attackers lived and began detaining people for questioning.
Tonight, the focus of the police investigation. A block of flats in Barking. So far, 12 people have been arrested. Women escorted from the building.
After such a horrific attack, it is critical that the police learn if any further attacks are being planned, and if there are any support networks that assisted the attackers. One imagines the questioning of the people detained would be very tough under these circumstances, and very stressful for any detainees. That's possible, but it's also very likely the interrogation sounded something like this.
You just have a seat for us. The guy I was speaking with.
This is tape from the interrogation of Russell Williams. At the time, Williams was the primary suspect in a series of murders of women in a small town in Canada. The interrogator is Detective Sergeant Jim Smith.
Gloves here. That's a little microphone, just to make sure there's nice and clear.
Listen to the tone he sets at the beginning of this interview.
All right. Well, again, Russell, I appreciate coming in. An investigation like this, I mean, I'm sure you can appreciate it's been big news. And, you know, obviously our approach to cases like this is that we don't give up on somebody being alive until we get evidence that they're not. So because of that, we're treating Jessica's case as an emergent situation, obviously. Yeah. So we're fast forwarding things that we might normally take our time with. And that's why we're here on a Sunday afternoon. Sure. So again, I appreciate it. Okay. We're going to do a pretty thorough interview today. Okay.
Well, we use this clip very frequently in training, and there's a number of reasons for that.
Lawrence Allison is the director of the Centre for Critical and Major Incident Psychology at the University of Liverpool. He is an expert in interrogation techniques.
What you have is a very personable, very forthright, very clear interviewer explaining the process, the procedures. He foreshadows the idea that this is going to be thorough, so it's highlighting the seriousness of it, but it's neither accusatory, it doesn't have any coercive elements to it, it's not threatening in any way, but it's very personable and clear. It's a nice settling start for an interviewee, for a detainee. Recently, Dr. Allison was given an unprecedented opportunity to study what works and what doesn't work when it comes to interrogation. The University of Liverpool was the only university to attain access to videos of real interrogations being performed on real detainees. They've now analyzed more than 1,200 hours of video, and the interrogations cover a broad range of detainees, from domestic right-wing terrorist groups to ISIS and ISIS-inspired terrorists to paramilitary groups. And up until our work, specifically in the policing and law enforcement arena and military, no one had really consulted with the theoretical literature on what worked with dealing with difficult people.
Okay, that likely strikes you as surprising. I mean, with all the focus recently on the need for reliable intelligence on extremist groups, it does seem odd that nobody looked too deeply into the theory of what works and what doesn't work when dealing with difficult people. But it's actually maybe not as surprising as you might think. Much of the research on this comes from a discipline that on first glance would appear to be miles away from interrogation. It comes from the field of counseling and therapy.
It doesn't seem an obvious thing to pull from the counseling literature how you deal with addiction or healthcare or eating behaviours or violence reduction into an interrogation context. But we found that those interviewers that are doing what we see the best counsellors do tend to get a better result.
2 researchers, Bill Miller and Stephen Rolnick, developed an approach called motivational interviewing. They'd used it to great success in addiction therapy.
And it's predicated on a variety of approaches or themes, or if you want to call them, an atmosphere that you create with your client. So prior to the 90s, in the US at least, the model of dealing with addictions was kind of to try and rationally persuade someone out of drinking, which would be, look, this is obviously bad for your health. This is ruining the relationship with your wife. This is ruining the relationship with your children. And they found that kind of rational persuasion technique just did not work. And Bill Miller had a client group, and he was repeatedly finding that people were giving up drinking. So they actually interviewed Bill, and they said, what is it that you are doing that seems to be encouraging behavioural change? And so a number of themes were found within what it was that Bill Miller was doing that was different from the other therapists. And they were things like providing a sense of personal autonomy for the client, allowing them to make the decisions rather than trying to rationally persuade them or corner them, being completely non-judgmental about the drinking behaviour, just letting them talk, which we call acceptance.
There's also something called evocation. That's trying to uncover the value system that is driving a person's behavior. Again, the key is to do this without judgment. It's also important for the interviewer to be flexible, allowing the interview to unfold in a natural way. And then the final key is to use empathy.
And people very often misunderstand empathy as a very warm, fuzzy, huggy feeling, but actually it's a much more clinical, antiseptic dissection of what's going on in the client's head. So rather than you trying to think, well, what would I do in your shoes? It's really about being professionally curious enough to imagine, based on what their upbringing, personal circumstances are, they might be thinking and feeling about the current drinking behaviour.
They also looked at the 50 to 60 years of research into interpersonal skills. Again, much of it coming from the field of counseling. It's a rich, complex, and nuanced field, but at its most basic, it covers a spectrum. On one end is confrontation, and on the other is cooperation.
Let's take someone like Gordon Ramsay, yeah? If Gordon Ramsay came in the room, what's the predominant relating style? It's to be dominant and conflict-driven, yeah? If you look at someone like Jamie Oliver, you've got a more mixed, versatile style where he's reasonably dominant, but not as dominant as Gordon Ramsay. He can be confrontational, but it tends to be more adaptive. He can do the sort of social, warm, cooperative stuff, and sometimes he can adopt a position in which he's more humble and seeking guidance. Now, we've taught this both to interrogators and also within the context of parent-child relationships. So if you imagine kind of lion being dominant, monkey being cooperative, mouse being humble, and T-Rex being conflict-driven. These are the animals that we teach kids, and they get that. So, when you ask them, what's daddy? What combination of animals is daddy? Well, he's kind of T-Rex lion. You get an idea of what daddy's doing at home. So all things being equal, the preferred parent relating style is lion monkey. You need to be dominant when you need to be, but also it needs to be done with a degree of love. So any one of these four archetypes, if you want to call them that, can be done well or badly.
There's no doubt this appears to be a more humane process for interrogation, but the purpose of Lawrence Allison's research is to discover whether or not it is effective. To do this, he and his colleagues logged hundreds of hours of interrogation tapes. Every 15 minutes, they would mark the interpersonal behaviors of everyone involved in the interrogation: the interviewers, the interviewee, the lawyer. They also marked the therapeutic skills of the interviewers, and then they took note of how much useful information the detainee provided. For example, did they talk about people, locations, or timings of an attack?
And, in very simple terms, what we found was that the more the interviewers stayed on the good wheel, the adaptive variants of dominance, cooperation, conflict, and submission, the more product they got. The more they were able to manage the detainee to stop bad interpersonal behaviour from the detainee, so they reduced provocations, insults, disengagement. That also led to more product, more people, location, action and time. And the more rapport-based strategies that the interviewers used, also the more product they got. So in very simple terms, if you use these skills, you reduce resistance and you increase product.
And it's very clear. The relationship there is very clear.
It's pretty clear. There are some small and not slightly counterintuitive anomalies that we're still unpacking, and we need to do a lot more work on the sequence of what works when. But it's pretty clear. If you attack or are sarcastic, you shut the person down, and they can flip from talking into and slip into a no comment interview very, very easily. If you try to be demanding and dogmatic and rigid and finger wagging, that shuts the person down. If you are too weak and uncertain and hesitant, that enables the detainee to adopt a quite bullying position. You don't get anything out of them. And equally, you can even get drawn into bad cooperative behaviour. Well, what do I mean by that? That's essentially getting over familiar, being, if you like, seduced by the detainee's charismatic style and not talking about the pertinent and relevant points. So as an interrogator, what you need to do is think, what am I dealing with? What's the best interpersonal style to match where this person wants me to be? Am I doing the adaptive variant of that behaviour? In other words, am I being adaptive dominant rather than maladaptive dominant? Therefore, I'm managing them. And how can I use these other, let's call them counselling skills, to start generating more information, intelligence and evidence from them? And what we found is, in the rare cases where we've looked at some interviews where we've got very maladaptive behaviour, I mean, not as severe as enhanced interrogation tactics or torture, of course, because that's been outlawed for many years. But even when you get some small element of bad interpersonal behaviour from the interrogator,
sort of more Gordon Ramsay than Jamie.
Yeah,
Oliver.
when you get a Gordon Ramsay, you tend to shut people down, and you'll have seen this in Hell's Kitchen or whatever. When Ramsay can do some adaptive dominant behaviours as well. You know, sometimes he's in a very good place in dominance, but sometimes he will slip into being rigid. And when you get that rigidity, that demanding, dogmatic nature, people can slip into being very uncertain, weak and hesitant, and he gets less out of them. But when he's in charge, setting the agenda and advising, even when he's very frank, forthright, confident and assertive, if you have those elements without the bad counterparts, you get stuff out of people. If you just stay on the bad wheel, you don't get stuff out of people. They either shut down, they become hesitant, they become weak, they become combative, they become overfamiliar, and the relationship is lost. So there's good lions, there's bad lions, there's good monkeys, there's bad monkeys, there's even good T-Rexes. You know, one of the things that often we think that our interviewers or interrogators assume is that when you turn up as a psychologist, I think sometimes they think that you are trying to say be nice. You are not there to be nice. You are not there to be their friend, but you have to treat people with dignity and respect. You have to be professionally curious. You have to interpersonally manage yourself, and you have to respond to them as an individual rather than as a thing or a machine from which you're just extracting information. The more you seek to understand them, the more you can control your own interpersonal behaviour, the more you can be good lion when it needs to be, the more product you can get from that person.
It's interesting.
And actually, I think it's not just about the evidence or the information yield. A lot of the best interrogators have a genuine desire to help the person that's in front of them. I mean, you know, that's kind of going almost beyond the moral boundary of tolerating something awful. But it's definitely true that the interrogators that are curious about how the person has ended up in front of them, that don't want to see them suffer, don't want to exact revenge on the person, tend to be the better interrogators. They are humanizing the person in front of them, and we all want to be understood.
Now, one of the things that would motivate you as a therapist is maybe not a clinical empathy, an actual genuine deep empathy for the
Right.
person in front of you, someone who's struggling with addiction or someone who's trying to improve their life. And all of these techniques that you describe, they really are, I mean, you know, that would be me in my social interactions on my very, very
Right.
best day.
Yeah.
Right? With a person I love deeply and care about deeply, and I'm throwing all of my
Yes.
effort into my interaction. So to me, it seems psychologically so demanding to ask this of an interrogator who's dealing with potential, you know, monstrous
Right.
individuals in front
Right.
of them.
Well, I think that's a very good point, and you know, the guys that we work with will kind of blush or laugh when I say this, but you know, these guys and girls that are doing these interviews, I think they're doing something which is incredibly heroic. Really, you know, they're dealing with people that have done awful things, often on their patch. So if we think of Manchester recently or any of the London attacks, I think it shows great moral backbone and fortitude to treat people with humanity when what they've done to you and your community is so awful. And I think that requires great emotional resolve. And these interrogators are having to seek to understand what it is that they have in front of them and not judge it, which I think would be the natural response. And there would be natural anger, feelings of revenge, feelings of wanting to get one's own back. So, to take an extraordinary example, if you've been in a military scenario and your best mate's just had a bilateral amputation because they've been blown up by an IED, the likelihood of you being able to use these techniques which require humanity, non-judgmental, positive regard is low. I mean, for a soldier to kill another person, you have to be able to dehumanize the enemy. To interview a person, you have to humanize the enemy. So you can't expect our soldiers to do both contradictory things. But what we found in our interrogators is they are, I'm not saying, of course, they condone or accept or tolerate the behavior that they have from a detainee, but they are seeking to understand why someone has got to the point of being so lost.
It is such a remarkable skill. If we go back to the clip I played you from the interrogation of Russell Williams, it's important to keep in mind that at the time there was still a woman missing. Police were hoping to find her alive, so it was critical to move quickly. And yet, the interrogation of Russell Williams appears almost painfully patient. Listen to how the interrogator waits for Russell Williams to begin to admit to the crimes.
I want to minimize the impact on my wife.
So do I.
So how do we do that?
Well, we start by telling the truth.
There are these unbelievably long pauses. When I watch it, I can't help but think, hurry up.
Okay.
Okay. So where is she?
Get a map.
And I wonder, is it possible to speed up the process? Could a more forceful approach deliver results more quickly?
I think it can be. It depends on who it is you're dealing with. But I think in this particular case, if you try to speed that up, you would have gone slower. Now, you do get cases where you get, for example, if you've got a very uncertain, weak and humble detainee, that enables you to adopt a dominant position because that person is lower. They are in that submissive position. And I've seen an interview in which a detainee walks in the room and is very, very lower submissive, and the interrogator is massively dominant, but critically they are dominant adaptive. So the interviewer comes in and he holds the hand of the detainee and he says, "Why are you here?" And the detainee says, "I don't know." And the interrogator says, excuse my language, "You do effing know," and looks at him clearly in the face. And the detainee says, "Is it about the ID?" He says, "Yes." "Where is it?" "I don't know." "You do know. Don't lie." And he tells him, and within about 7 minutes, he's told him where the bomb is, how it was placed there, why it was placed there, who it was placed by. Now, in that situation, that interrogator had a time-critical, time-sensitive, urgent interview. And because he had a detainee that was very submissive, he was able to adopt a strategy which was powerful, but was never demanding, dogmatic or rigid, was never cruel, inhumane or degrading, but it was very powerful. And I remember seeing the interview that was conducted 6 weeks later with that detainee, and they were both sat on the floor, and the interrogator said to the detainee, "I'm sure you'll be looking forward to getting back to your family." And the detainee said, "I will miss you."
Really?
Which I think, you can have a bit of conflict with someone and still gain rapport.
It's such an incredible dynamic process that you're describing. It's not a checklist of
Correct.
techniques. So do this
Yep.
now do this.
Yep.
Once you've done step 1 and 2, move on to step 3.
Yes.
It seems more art than science.
I think there's an element of it which is intuitive. I don't think you can make a bad interrogator a good interrogator. I think you can make a bad interrogator less bad. You can make a really excellent interrogator slightly better. The science to it is establishing and codifying, classifying and noting how powerful each of these effects are. But you're absolutely right. You need to be fluid. And the reason that we need to be fluid is human beings are complex. They work on probabilistic elements rather than checklists, and as you say, if you do 1, 2, 3, that doesn't always work. And of course, you could have the best interpersonal skill, most interpersonally skilled, most rapport-based interviewer in the world, and with certain detainees, it is not going to work. But the point is, it's your best chance. It's your best chance of it working. So if you do the opposite of these things, you don't care about how you interpersonally manage someone, you treat them in a degrading, revengeful way, you have no interest in them as an individual, you provide no sense of personal autonomy, people resist. So you can make things a lot worse. You can't always make things better, but you can make things a hell of a lot worse.
I know you go around training police and investigators on this. And how open do you find they are to these techniques or to your research?
I think they're unbelievably generous and giving of themselves, open to ideas. All the best interrogators have no ego. They leave their ego outside their room. They're ready to listen. I was in the US last week working with some of these guys and girls, and I always say at the end of the session that it's such a privilege to work with them, and I really do mean that. I mean, my job is really easy. I observe what they do. They do what they do, and I have nothing but respect for these people that are doing a really difficult job under tremendously difficult circumstances and never ever get any recognition for it. They're not terribly well paid jobs either, and they do it by and large because they care, and they've got no ego about it, and I think what they do is phenomenal. But they're very receptive. I think it'd be very easy for police officers that have been in the field to think, oh God, we've really got to listen to this psychologist for 3 days. But it always surprises me and thrills me that they're happy to listen, that they're happy to take advice, and I never ever shove it down their throat, of course. It's all about an interaction, and that what I really love watching is a really good interrogation. I never ever enjoy watching a bad one. When you see someone dealing with someone difficult, artfully, skillfully, and extracting information in a way which is both morally right, legally admissible, and gets a result on a job, it is such a joy to watch. We've even had examples where on real interrogations, the detainee has written a letter thanking the interviewer for how they've been treated. It's an amazing thing to see. I mean, I don't think you get anything more rich or psychologically fascinating than two people interacting on something that neither of them necessarily want to share with one another, but they go on a bit of a journey together.
It's been a real pleasure for me to be able to speak with you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Neil. Thank you.
Lawrence Allison is the director of the Center for Critical and Major Incident Psychology at the University of Liverpool. And that's it for the University of Liverpool podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. And please give us a rating and a review in iTunes. Now, the only way to do that is through the iTunes store. So I will include a link to the program in the show notes for this episode. Even better, if you know someone who you think might enjoy this podcast or some of our previous episodes, please share the podcast with them. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks. I'm Neil Morrison.
You're listening to the University of Liverpool podcast, brought to you by the University of Liverpool online programs. Make a plan to advance your career today. Study a postgraduate degree with a world-class university without leaving your home or full-time job. You don't have to go far to go further.